Father in heaven, we thank you for your word about your Son, Jesus. Please, would you show us wonderful things about him now, for his name's sake. Amen. Well, I'm going to start with a bit of a personal question, if you don't mind. Well, tough. But what is the most humiliating thing you've ever done? Don't worry, I'm not going to get you to share it with anyone. But what is it when you think about it, your cheeks begin to burn? Or how do you feel when you witness someone else doing something really embarrassing? I don't know about you, but I begin to just feel awkward in myself anyway. It can even be, watching a film or watching TV, and you see just, some fictional thing happening, and I can be squirming in my seat at some of those embarrassing moments. Well, for Jesus' closest friends and followers, they experienced something of that awkwardness on the night before he died. It's in that episode that we had read from John chapter 13. The disciples were super embarrassed and awkward at what Jesus was doing. Jesus explains why they felt so bad. He says, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterwards," meaning after he's died on the cross and risen from the grave, "afterwards you will understand." They feel embarrassed and awkward about Jesus because they don't get what he's come to do. And the same kind of thing happens today. The idea of being a Christian and following Jesus to most people in the UK seems odd at best. I was on a speed awareness course the other day. That's a whole different story. About halfway through, we were asked as participants, what can you do when you're kind of under pressure to help things? And one of the things I said was pray. That led to a bit of an interesting discussion. And in the conversation that followed, it came out that I was a vicar, at which point one of the participants kind of stares at me, goggle-eyed, as if I'm some kind of alien. I've never met a vicar before. To this lady, I was this weird, rare species. Now, maybe you're here this morning and you feel the same. The idea of you being a committed Christian, you would find laughable. Well, if you're prepared to be open-minded for the next 15 minutes and listen to what Jesus is saying, you might be surprised. You might just find that Jesus is more astonishing and more compelling than you ever thought he could be. And for those who are committed Christians here this morning, how aware are you of just how alien true Christianity is to our culture today? Most people are in the dark about who Jesus is and what he's done. This term, on Sunday mornings, we're going to be looking at chapters 13 to 17 of John's Gospel, and we're going to see wonderful word pictures of who Jesus is and of what he's come to do from Jesus' own lips. And as we listen to Jesus, we're going to be better equipped and better motivated to make him known as a result. Well, this morning, I want to share with you 3 things from this little episode. Firstly, at the end of verse 1, it says, he loved them to the end. The first thing we're going to think about is Jesus' love. And we'll spend more time on this than anything else. From the upper room, which is where Jesus' disciples are now, to the cross, to the resurrection, it is all a demonstration of Jesus' love. Jesus is there in the upper room with his 12 closest followers. And they're beginning to celebrate the Jewish Passover meal, that celebration of God's deliverance in the past. Now, ancient dining wasn't done on chairs and round a table like we would today. They were probably arranged in a kind of a horseshoe shape around a low table, be on a cushion resting on their left arm, and then eating with their right, with the feet pointing away from the table. Well, Jesus gets up off the floor, takes off some of his outer clothes, and ties a towel to his waist. There is total stunned silence as Jesus does this. As one by one, he comes to each of the disciples, he's filled a basin with water, and he washes their feet. Israel was a dry, dusty country. There was no sewer system. Domesticated animals shared the roads with people, and you wore open-toed sandals. Now can you understand why only those with the lowest social status would ever be asked to wash people's feet? It's really, really embarrassing and awkward for the disciples. When it's Simon Peter's turn, he's ever the headstrong one, he can't contain himself. There's no way you're washing my feet, Jesus. It's not like Peter had some kind of, problem with feet. I've been doing a lot of training. I'm going to run the Great North Run shortly. And I've got a bit of a gammy toe. I wouldn't want you anywhere near my feet right now. Well, in all the Jewish and Roman writing that we have from that time, there's not one example, not one, of someone with higher social standing washing the feet of someone lower. This is so totally below Jesus, it is unthinkable. Here's the Messiah, that's God's promised ruler and forever king and rescuer. Jesus has been walking on earth proving that this has been the fact. Only a few weeks earlier, he raised his friend Lazarus from death to life. And here is Jesus, the Messiah, the Lord, doing the job of a lowly slave. No, Peter just can't let Jesus do it. Until Jesus says in verse 8, well, if I don't wash you, then you have no share with me. Peter doesn't understand, just like Jesus said. You see, this isn't just about Jesus washing their feet. It's a symbol, it's a picture. He's teaching them about his love. The foot washing is symbolic of what's going to happen at the cross. And that's why the understanding will come later for Peter and the other disciples. Jesus says to all of us, we need to come to him for a wash. Not on the outside, but on the inside. That our hearts, our souls need a deep clean. Think about this. Where do war or climate change or violence or theft or gossip or slander come from? There are many complexities behind each of those things, many different causes and triggers. But Jesus says that at bottom, they all start in the human heart. When we want something we shouldn't. Or when we want something more than we should, we just have to have it. Selfishness, pride, indifference, greed, they all come from in here. And Jesus says that makes us unfit for God's perfect presence. Our hearts and our lives should be clean, but they are stained and grubby. There's still the original good that God put in there that's visible, but it's all mixed up and mixed in with all the mess and brokenness. And so by nature, we are shut out of God's presence. There's no entry to heaven because we'd mess it up, like trailing muddy boots through a clean house. But Jesus' love is so great, he was willing to die on the cross to wash our hearts clean. He gave up his perfect life on the cross so we could be cleansed, so we could be welcomed home to God. And we're going to see this again and again as we look at chapters 13 to 17 this term. Well, once Jesus convinces Peter, classic Peter, he jumps in with both feet. Great, well, wash my head and my hands as well, Jesus. I'm all in. And Jesus uses Peter's eagerness to make another point, a different point, about the cleansing his cross will bring. Many here will know that we were lucky enough to be able to go on holiday to Fuerteventura this summer. And on most days we'd have a shower to get clean before heading out for tea. Now, Fuerteventura is a really dry place. So by the time you got kind of back home from being out for tea, your feet would be all dusty and dirty again. We didn't need to jump in the shower to get fully clean. It was just needing to give our feet a rinse. And Jesus is saying the same thing here. You only need a wash once. His work at the cross, when someone's received that, doesn't need to be repeated. Now, of course, Christians certainly still mess up, often frequently, sometimes in huge ways. But Jesus says that once you've come to him, you are definitively clean and cleansed. You are forgiven. And just like we've done earlier in our service, we still need to confess. We still need to say sorry and have Jesus' forgiveness applied to our consciences again and again, a bit like needing to have your feet washed after you've had a bath. Or to put it another way, if you come to Jesus and become a Christian, you don't enter a kind of an on-off relationship with Jesus. That's not possible. You have security and stability, even when you mess up again and again, as we all do. Jesus' love took him to the cross to cleanse us. And there's nothing that we're going to do now that's going to stop him from loving us and forgiving us. Jesus does this foot washing for his disciples as a symbol, as a sign of his love poured out at the cross. Secondly, and more briefly, Jesus' example. In verse 15, very simply, he says, I've given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. Jesus claimed and proved to be God in the flesh walking on earth, and yet he stooped to serve. Jesus washing the disciples' feet, it wasn't a one-off thing, it was typical of his whole ministry. All of Jesus' earthly life was one of humble service. And he says to anyone who will follow him, go and do likewise. In our reading from Philippians, the Apostle Paul makes exactly the same point. Look at, see Jesus' astonishing humility and take on the same mindset. Don't think what others can do for you, but what you can do for others. Stop just putting your self-interests first, but think also of what others need. Verse 3 really drives this home when it tells us what Jesus was thinking as he got up to wash his disciples' feet. Verse 3 says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he'd come from God and was going back to God, then he gets up and washes their feet. I mean, imagine you've won the Euro Millions jackpot and you've been elected Prime Minister. You wouldn't be at your mate's house cleaning their loo, would you? Jesus has been given infinitely more by his Father, and yet there he is, washing their feet. But of course he is. Of course Jesus is. He's heading to the cross. This is just what God is like. Other person-centered, sacrificial love. Not standing on his rights, but stooping to serve. If your picture of God doesn't look like Jesus, then you're not picturing the Christian God, the God of the Bible. Jesus then doesn't ask any more of us than he has done. In fact, he asks of us far, far less. If you're a Christian, how are you doing at following Jesus' example? I'm not going to embarrass anyone here, but I get to see some wonderful glimpses of this across our church family. Of course, there's still plenty of room for growth in all of us. And how great it would be, just how much more of a blessing we could be to one another and to our community here in Bispam if we were that bit more like Jesus in this respect. We've thought about Jesus' love, his example, and finally, Jesus' call. Verses 19 and 20 say this. I'm telling you this now, before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am he. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives the one who sent me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. In love, Jesus came as God in the flesh to give his perfect life for ours. He freely offers cleansing and forgiveness and a place in God's family. And he calls everyone, everywhere, to come to him and follow. But how can anyone believe such massive claims? Well, if you were with us earlier in John's Gospel, we've seen there's proof in both Jesus' words and Jesus' works, what he does. And right here he's saying, listen, I'm telling you things that are going to happen before they do, that no one else sees coming, that no one else expects, so that you'll believe me. What he's talking about is Judas's betrayal. Judas is about to betray Jesus, about to give up someone he's been following for the past 3 years to death. And Jesus knows this. No one else does. None of the other disciples expect it. But yet Judas is there at the Last Supper. Judas is there when Jesus washes his feet. That's Jesus' love in action. He even washes Judas's feet, knowing exactly what's going to happen.